Imagine having the title of world's most expensive transfer. For many, it's a badge of honour, a show of appreciation for all of your hard work and talent. Many players live up to expectation and prove their worth, whether it be Cristiano Ronaldo, Ruud Gullit or Diego Maradona. However, this isn't always the case, and some players just struggle to live up to the transfer fee. But in the case of the player we're going to talk about today, arguably no one who has held the world's most expensive transfer title has ever had such a tragic story regarding their football career. From ripping world champions apart to being mere inches away from certain death, this is the story of Gigi Lentini. Born south of Turin, Lentini took a huge interest in football from a young age, and when Torino offered trials, he couldn't resist. After the trials at 10 years of age, Lentini was offered a place in Torino's famous youth sector, known as Philadelphia, which was being ran by Sergio Vata. Vata had a real eye for talent, influencing players such as Dino Baggio, Bobo Vieri, Gianluigi Buffon, and Francesco Totti. Compared to the great Gigi Moroni, Lentini quickly caught the eyes of many. A fast, tricky winger who can play on either side, at 17, he was handed his Torino and Serie A debut in a 2-0 loss to Brescia under manager Gigi Radice. After 2 years struggling to find a consistent spot in the starting 11, Torino sent Lentini out on loan to Serie B club Ancona, where he enjoyed his first real full season. Lentini returned to Torino at the end of the season with the club in a much different state. They had a new manager, a new owner, and they were now in the second division. Lentini would make his mark on the side in the second half of the season, scoring 6 goals in the final 10 games as I Granata ran through the league, securing promotion. Torino would then spend big, signing Rafa Vazquez from Real Madrid, one of Belgium's greatest players ever Enzo Scifo, and Brazilian striker big Walter Casagrande. And under Emiliano Mondonico, they would finish 5th and 3rd in their first 2 seasons back in Serie A. Lentini was the star of the show, making fools of fullbacks all over the country. None more as high profile as recent world champion and scorer in the final, Andy Bremer, in the early stages of the 1990-91 season. In the 91-92 season, Torino made the UEFA Cup final after historically taking down Real Madrid in the semis. Lentini shone in the semi-final, with his incredible wing play being the catalyst for Torino's 2 goals in the second leg. But in typical Torino fashion, it would end in heartache. In the second leg of the final against the star-studded Ajax, the Dutch side's goal lived an incredibly charmed life. Torino hit the woodwork 3 times in a 0-0 draw, and as the first leg ended 2-2 in Turin, Louis van Gaal's Ajax ran away with the trophy. It was to be the beginning of the end of what was a short but successful spell for Torino. Sure, they would win the Coppa Italia in the next season, but it would be done without Lentini. Ever since the 50s, Italian sides spent big. In fact, from 1952 to 1990, the world transfer record had been broken 14 times, with 12 of them being broken by Italian clubs. However, in 1992, the Serie A made history by breaking the world transfer record 3 times. Jean-Pierre Papin moved to Milan from Marseille, Gianluca Vialli from Sampdoria to Juventus, and Gigi Lentini from Torino to Milan. The Rossoneri themselves breaking records by becoming the first side to break the world transfer record twice in a single window, something only Real Madrid have matched. The price was so large, even the Vatican had a say on it, writing in their local newspaper that the transfer was an offence to the dignity of work. With Torino being in severe financial trouble, star assets had to leave, including their prized winger. Much like Moroni in the 60s, Lentini looked like he'd moved to city rivals Juventus, but the old lady decided against the transfer, probably thinking about all the Fiat workers that were Torino fans. What this did was give other clubs an opportunity to make the signing, and that club was Milan, led by media tycoon Silvio Berlusconi. Such was his loyalty to Torino, Lentini actually declined Berlusconi in Milan, but he was soon made aware that he had very little say in the matter. Borsano tried to deflect the blame onto Lentini, claiming he forced the move, however Torino fans quickly saw through it. On the 30th of June 1992, the deal was complete, and for 65 billion lira, or around £13 million, Gianluigi Lentini became the world's most expensive footballer. So, how good was the Milan side he was joining? Well, the Rossoneri were in the midst of one of their greatest eras ever. Under Arrigo Sacchi, Milan had won the European Cup back-to-back, and they housed some of the world's best players, including the Dutch trio of Frank Rijkaard, Ruud Gullit and Marco van Basten. Once Sacchi left in the summer of '91, former midfielder Fabio Capello took over. And it's fair to say that his first season in charge went rather well, as Milan not only won the league, but they became the first side in Serie A history to win it undefeated. Heading into the next season, Serie A once again changed its laws on foreign players. You still could only have a maximum of 3 foreign players play for a side in a single match, but you could now have as many as you want on the books. Milan took advantage of this when alongside Lentini they signed Jean-Pierre Papin, the maverick Dejan Savicevic and midfield all-rounders Zvonimir Boban. Capello had something no manager had ever had before, a deep squad, and this Milan side with world-class stars wherever you looked could be rotated, something completely new in the world of football. Now, despite being booed wherever he went due to his exorbitant fee, Lentini and Milan started off like a house on fire. In fact, the winger's first goal showed just how great his technical ability was when, in a 5-4 away win at Pescara, he scored a bicycle kick. The Rossoneri's first few games were insane, and they were on their way to breaking every record in the book. At the start of the season, they won a joint record 7 Serie A games, and in all competitions, it was 16 games, 14 wins, 2 draws, scoring 54 and only conceding 14. Although Lentini had only scored 3 of the goals, putting the ball into the back of the net wasn't his job. His job was to stretch play, run at defenders and create chances, which is exactly what he was doing. Although Milan was smashing all the records, Capello wasn't too happy with how open they were at the back. Capello decided to tighten up, and this meant Lentini, who was capable, had to track back a lot more. Add this to the fact Capello felt forced to constantly rotate with so many star players, Lentini had to play a bit of everywhere, so consistency was hard to come by. By tightening the defence up, Milan won another league title, but outside of a handful of standout performances and a goal in the derby, it was a pretty hit and miss season for Lentini. However, he had 1 game left to salvage his season. Dominating the competition like no team before, Milan were in the first ever Champions League final in its new format. Their opponents were French champions Marseille, who under owner Bernard Tapie were essentially the French version of Milan, employing many stars of world football. Milan, who came in as heavy favourites, were a much stronger attacking side. However, a Basile Boli header just before half-time condemned the Italian side to a defeat. Now, considering Marseille were caught match-fixing their previous league game and referee Kurt Rufflesberger was caught match-fixing a few years later, this ended up being a tough loss to take. The Champions League final also turned out to be the final game for the great Marco van Basten, and for a second time in a row, Lentini had lost the European final. But sadly, things would only get worse. On the 2nd of August 1993, after a pre-season tournament in Genoa, Lentini embarked on the 170-kilometer journey to Turin to see Rita Schillaci. If the name Schillaci rings a bell, yes, she was the wife of Italian anti-hero and current Inter striker Toto Schillaci. However, I feel it is important to say that Toto and Rita were unofficially no longer an item by this point, and Rita and Gigi's relationship was known. During the trip, the tyre on Lentini's Porsche 911 punctured and was replaced with a skinnier wheel that couldn't exceed 50 miles an hour. With Rita waiting impatiently, Lentini put his foot down, and on the A21 motorway, driving in excess of 120 miles per hour, Lentini's spare tyre burst. His car, now out of control, crashed, and Lentini was thrown into the central reservation. With his Porsche close by, Lentini was pulled away from the wreckage by a truck driver just before the vehicle burst into flames, and in hospital with a fractured skull and damaged eye socket, the world's most expensive player was put into an induced coma. Lentini came out of his coma after a couple of days and was recovering well, being able to recognise his father and friends. The medical director at Turin Hospital said there should be nothing to prevent him returning to football, but don't ask me when. Most people felt sorry for Lentini, however one man who didn't was Capello. If anything, the Italian was more annoyed at Lentini for putting his life at risk in such a way, and really, he never treated the winger the same ever again. The winger returned to action in the January of 1994, but really struggled for game time, with many believing the crash and subsequent coma cost Lentini of his cognitive skills. Teammate Marcel Desailly said, "You could see the skills, how he was before and after. The balance was completely different." The lack of game time also likely cost Lentini of a spot at the 1994 World Cup, where Italy finished as runners-up. Although if it's of any consolation, he made the bench for that season's Champions League final, when a Milan side without many of its best players destroyed the heavily favoured dream team that was Johan Cruyff's Barcelona. Remarkably, in the season where he had as little impact on the side as he'd ever have, Lentini was a European champion, and it nearly happened again. In 1995, Milan made their third successive Champions League final, this time against Ajax, the same side Capello lost to as a player, also a side Lentini was desperate to get revenge on after the UEFA Cup final, and Lentini had a real chance of playing. You see, Lentini started the season off by hardly kicking a ball, but he ended the season in what he considered to be the form of his life, playing in the final 9 league games, scoring 5 in the process. However, for the final, Capello decided to bench him as Ajax won 1-0. It was that day where Lentini lost his love for the game. With Milan bolstering their attack, Lentini's Milan career quickly fizzled out, only lasting one more season, scoring his final goal against Cagliari and playing his last game against Sampdoria. He did still manage to add a third league title to his resume in the process though. A return with his former manager Mondonico beckoned, and he didn't have to move far, joining Atalanta where his form really picked up, combining with that season's capocannoniere Pippo Inzaghi. And for the final time, Lentini even got a national team call-up. Lentini really enjoyed his time at Ledea, but his heart yearned for one club, Torino. The side he loved was stuck in Serie B and were in a financial mess, meaning if Lentini was to join, he'd have to take a huge pay cut, which he did, saying, "I would never have played in Serie B except for Torino. I was always a Torino fan at heart." When Lentini joined, Liverpool legend Graham Souness was Torino's manager, but after a disastrous 98 days, he left, and with Eduardo Reja now in charge, promotion was on the cards, until Torino lost in the promotion tiebreaker on penalties to Perugia. Promotion followed the next season, but in typical Torino fashion, they were relegated instantly, with Lentini even scoring an own goal in the derby against Juventus. Once the world's most expensive footballer, Lentini had one more season with Torino before moving away from the limelight, playing in the lower divisions of Italian football, even playing at an amateur level for his hometown club, Carmignola. The story of Gianluigi Lentini is one of triumph and tragedy. He played for his boyhood club and won some of the biggest trophies with one of the world's biggest institutions. But, realistically, he was fortunate to be alive, and faced with his own mortality being questioned, talent only took Lentini so far, when truly, his biggest roadblock became his love for the game.